But the most important thing is whether you're talking about teamwork in an aquarium or you're talking about teamwork in the universe, that's really what he's all about, is bringing in the right things to feed everybody what they need.
Yeah. Welcome to the Hickory Podcast. I am Dr. Ann Verdevec with my co-hosts, Sharon Anderson Morris and Wilfred Audley. Hickory stands for Hope, Health, and Healing in concert with ourselves and the earth. Our conversations and our interviews are meant to inspire hope, health, and healing.
I'm excited to be here today with my BFF, Ann Verdevec. And today, interviewing, I think, Larry, I would have to call you one of the top 3 smartest men in the world that I know, and I don't know who the other 2 are right now. He has been a long time friend of mine. I met Larry Smarr through the Future in Review conference, and he was an honored speaker almost every year since 2003 because he's so brilliant in so many areas. I asked Larry to give me a 5 to 7 bullet point of who he is and what's going on with him, and it's so in depth scientifically that I want to try to simplify this because even though I've interviewed in Park City in person, I think that for me to say what I know about you to the world would be much easier to understand, and I'll use some of the terminology that you used as well. I think that obviously you're an expert in climate change, which we really never talked about. You're one of those people that are experts in so many things. It just shows your brilliance and your compassion for the world and its beings. You are one of the originators of Cal IT2, University of California, San Diego, Irvine. I was fortunate many times to be able to go in and see your work as you do, so beautifully with a collaborative team of all the pixels of your biome, your gut.
Yep.
And to see the work that you've done with computation, with climate change, genomics. I know that you've been, you're an expert in astrophysics. You drove the creation of the National Science Foundation supercomputer centers and today's distributed cyber structure. You are always a team, you always bring a team of people together. And that's just really, I see, key to part of your success is that you're the brilliant force behind everything. And then you find the smart people to bring on to go forward with you. And that's something that you and I didn't talk about recently, but I think that you probably acknowledge that you always have a great team that supports your work.
But the way that you learn about lots of different topics in depth is from the real experts in lots of different fields. The normal path in universities, to get a PhD and then to become a professor and so forth, is to specialize. That's the whole advancement. How many single author papers have you written, and in your very narrow field, but you're one of the best in the world in that very narrow field. And from the beginning, I always wanted to know about a lot of different topics. Even when I was an undergraduate at the University of Missouri, and I did all the graduate courses in physics and math while I was an undergraduate, but I insisted on getting a Bachelor of Arts degree, which I was the first, I think, to do that in physics, because I wanted to take Greek art history and archaeology. I wanted to learn about philosophy. I wanted to learn about, economics. and in lots of other fields. And so I started out with a broader base than normal. And then when I got into astrophysics, I did it because it was the science that studied the most complex systems in the universe. And you had to know all these different, you had to not just know gravitation and electromagnetism and particles and relativity and all of these things, gravity, but you had to have them all interact with each other. And so you couldn't really do the work as a specialist. You had to have this broader view. And that led me into using supercomputers, which at that time you had to get like in my case, you had to get a top secret nuclear weapons clearance to be able to get to supercomputers because they were just in the national laboratories. And so I did a lot of my astrophysics there, and later in Germany, where they had the first American-built supercomputer in Europe. That here I was, sort of an expatriate coming over in the summer to work on that because I couldn't get access in the country. So when I said, this is crazy, we ought to be able to have supercomputers for all the university researchers in our own country. And I wrote a proposal in SF, and it got funded. And that set off the whole supercomputer center revolution in the country, both for academics and then for industry. But in doing that, I realized that all these different fields of science and engineering were able to go to sort of like light speed by using supercomputers, which were like hundreds of times faster than anything else that you could get your hands on. And so I wrote a book with a co-author from astronomy on basically a powers of 10 book. So it's taking everything in the world, starting from subatomic particles, and then moving up through chemistry and eventually into the environment, and then into the planets, and then into Earth and the whole Earth system, and then cosmic, astrophysics and so forth. And I went through and found the best example that an expert in that field had written a paper on. And I was able to write a book that had not only 100 stories like that across all those disciplines, but it had 200 color images of how this all worked. And so that's where I got this to read all those. Of course, I had a shelf bigger than the one behind me of the #1 undergraduate and graduate textbook on all those different fields. It was about 12 feet of books that I worked through. And so this is not a normal academic upbringing. But it enabled me to then be able to have intelligent conversations with a wide diversity of researchers on the front lines of all these different fields. And going back to when I was a kid, and this gets into some of the environmental aspects. I grew up in Missouri, and in central Missouri, and on a sort of a big 4-acre flower bed, fundamentally. And I remember spending a lot of time lying on the grass, looking up and watching the dynamics of the clouds. Clouds actually, move and change if you just take the time to watch them. And I remember daydreaming, and people always say, well, what do you want to be when you're going to grow up? And I said, well, it seems to me that the thing that we're missing is institutions that can bring together people from all different disciplines and have them work together on bigger problems than they would individually want to go after. And those are the problems that the world really faces. So I think that had a lot to do with what I was able to accomplish later. And it's only because of all the brilliant people that universities, attract and develop that I could work with. But they had individual departments and so forth. But like when we built the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, Cal IT2, that actually brings in faculty and students from 24 departments on both the UCSD, or UC San Diego, and UC Irvine campuses to work on projects. And those projects involve not just the science, but the socioeconomic context, the regulatory, legal, ethical context. And it spans all the way from, medicine to climate change to wildfire early detection. And as we did that, we had to reach out to actually, for instance, the wildfire projects. We ended up having to work with CAL FIRE. We used to go and have beer and pizza, with the firefighters, so we could get a better understanding of what they had and didn't have, and what the university could provide. But normally, faculty in the university don't think that's who they should be working with. On the other hand, many of our great universities are land grant universities, and those were founded, like the University of Illinois, where I was a professor for 20 years. If you look at their shield, it's the wheat sheaves and the gears. So these universities were founded, actually was during President Lincoln's time, to develop technology and then make that available to the economy. And the economy in those days were agriculture and the emerging American industrial base in the 1860s. And that's where the, land grant universities ended up with agricultural field stations and all of this stuff. So we come from a tradition of working on societal problems with the people in the society, whether it's medical practitioners or firefighters or
Right.
whoever, whose day job it is to do that, but who don't have this technological innovation injection into their work.
So let's stop there for a second, because Ed, I think you were part of, no, I know that you were the reason that I think I think it was our first CTO challenge at the Future in Review conference about how to avoid forest fires. And this, was that a 2004? And you brought together a team of people. What year?
Well, this was when the Future in Review was in
Del Coronado.
This is when the Future in Review was meeting in San Diego.
Yeah.
And so we were able to bring in the San Diego lead for CAL FIRE and one of the commissioners, one of the supervisors for the county, whose job it was to do that. So again, it was this idea of bringing, in that case, FIRE was able to bring together the chief technology officers of a number of technology companies.
FIRE being Future in Review.
Future in Review conference.
Fire working on fire.
Yeah, well, that was it. That was it. What could be more natural?
Yeah.
Right.
And it was really interesting because what Larry put together was a team of people that created, and I'll never forget the answers. The challenge is how do you prevent forest fires from actually even starting? Or when they start, how do you mitigate it immediately? And that team of people, it was just fascinating. Discovered how to, within 5 minutes, which was a critical time, how to put out a fire so that it didn't become a gigantic forest fire.
Yeah, well, these are more wildfires than so the forest fires are on a lot of the more mountainous terrain, U.S. But in the Southern California where we were, they're mainly mesquite driven and sort of more wild area fires. And yeah, once those things, the trouble is we have these Santa Ana winds where we can literally have 100-mile-an-hour wind coming over the desert and then down the mountain. And as it comes, it into the city, like San Diego, which we had huge forest fires, wildfires back in several times in the last 20 years, and they destroyed major areas. But if the with the winds, if the fire starts during these dangerous Santa Ana winds, it can spread so fast that you really can't stop it. And so the question was, well, could we use the kind of thing that we see us use when we do wars around the world, where we have drones and things? Could we actually spot them and then have drones ready to drop fire retarding on it when it's still a small fire before it gets out of control?
Right.
And so the CTOs came up with, workflows that would work in those kind of situations. But the main thing is,
CTOs equals Chief Technology Officers.
yeah, so it's the idea is to take real problems that exist in the world and get together a lot of brilliant researchers, scientists, engineers, and then say, here's the problem. Let's think of how we could do it.
Yeah.
And that sort of shortcuts the kind of waiting until somehow, a company comes up with it or a startup or something. And so that's, of course, universities are set up, like I say, from the beginning as land grant universities to work with our society and our economy. But they don't necessarily always do that. And that's why I had to invent several of these institutions in the university to have that interface on real world problems.
Right. So my thought process is that you are the initiator of building a team of experts to solve a problem. And so the reason I'm talking about the forest fire team to immediately identify and put out the fire before it becomes an issue is now because of climate change, not just California. It's, I'm on the side of a mountain in Park City, Utah. My insurance, homeowner's insurance, is just canceled just because I live on the side of a mountain. And this is not just Utah. Now it's in so many areas. And that response and the answers that your team came up with, I wish, and I think we should share that, because it really only makes sense about the solution.
Right.
If you can visualize, if you can have something on the top of the mountain that detects the fire within 5 minutes, that and then mitigate that, then you have a chance. Otherwise, it's out of control. And you did that, and that was a long time ago.
Come up with the ideas, but see, the trouble is you have to find in society institutions whose job it would be to implement these kind of solutions. And that's where so much of the problem is. But let me go back, I think, a little bit more generally to some of the things that you've been talking about on the Hickory podcast. So, one of the things that I spent a lot of my life looking at is complex ecological systems and their dynamics of how they interact not only with the animals and plants with each other, but with the bacteria, with the chemistry, with the whole environment that they're embedded in. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because it's less about the institutional things I've done, and it's more about how I've come to see the world and actually how that helps me relax and deal with the level of intensity that I have dealt with for 50 years and still keep going.
Hope, health, and healing.
Well,
so let's do that.
Okay, so I think a lot of it came from my growing up on what you would call a an urban farm. That is, this was a 4 acres at the edge of Columbia, Missouri. And my grandparents came there during the Depression and bought it from back taxes. And they had been in the flower business. And in fact, I'm a 5th generation horticulturalist. If I trace back through my great grandparents, all of them were horticulturalists. And
Yeah.
so, in fact, America, and particularly during its founding period, was agriculture. In fact, it was agriculture. Most people lived out on the farm or outside of cities until, the 1800s, late 1800s. So it's really at the core of what being an American is. And I grew up like that. They had converted it, which was just scrub brush and everything, into gradually over a decade or two into these incredible gardens that became a must stop when you're going through central Missouri. And I just grew up all day, every day, surrounded by either growing flowers, or eventually they decided to make a business. So my parents actually had a flower shop, Smarr florist, in our house. And we kids were basically the staff. We got paid by getting to eat. But I mean, it was just all the time. Now, what that does is you learn to pay attention to plant life and its cycles of life. And it wasn't like I went to botany school or something. It was just, that's what you did. You planted seeds, you watched them grow, you waited for them to get buds, you watched them in case they had insects or something, they had some kind of mold or something. You had to, I mean, you just spent your good fraction of your life helping the plants to grow, mature, bloom, reproduce, make fruit, vegetables, harvest it. And so, I mean, my father would grow things like he would buy up, just sort of as a hobby, he bought various pieces of land around Columbia, and he bought a ½ acre of Missouri River bottom soil, where the topsoil was, I don't know how many feet deep, and he said, okay, boys, we're going to make I had 2 younger brothers. So we're going to make a garden. And so over quite a few years, this ½ acre had everything you could imagine growing in a vegetable or garden. And then we would, have to keep it. That was one thing he was very keen on. We had to keep it weed free, which meant by hand with hose, going in and doing this. And so the whole cycle of life of plants, I just knew intimately because I just grew up that way. That's how we made our food. That's what we ate. I mean, in fact, meat was so unusual as an idea. I didn't, until I was dating a girl, I don't know whether it was high school or maybe it was even college. Maybe it was, probably late high school. And I took her out to a restaurant and she ordered a steak. And I looked at that thing and I said, never seen a steak. How do you get sugar to stick together like that to make a steak? And I just was unaware that there was all this meat industry out there. So anyway, the point is that when I later went into astrophysics, of course, I went into these very complex, dynamic, multi-component systems, which I realized were essentially obeying the same kind of ecological laws in a way that the living world was. And so, I just got fascinated with this. And then I realized that it wasn't just trees and vegetables and things like that. And I had, during the summer, my parents would take me would drive down to Pensacola, Florida, and we would go and, find shells on the beach and everything. We got used to the ocean. Well, once I got, we got married, my wife and I realized we would go off to like Hawaii or the Caribbean, and we would snorkel. And I discovered that the planet has two completely different planets that are sewn together at the surface of the ocean. And we're almost all thinking about what's above the ocean surface. It's on the plants and land, everything like that. But there's this incredible living world below the surface of the ocean. And so we learned to scuba dive, but mainly we almost always snorkel because it puts you in a much closer personal relationship to this incredible ecology of corals and fish and everything that are there. And that was sort of the similar awakening to me of the ocean world, that the living and the growing of farm, vegetables and everything had been for the land world of living things. And so when we both became professors at Illinois in about 1980, I said, well, why can't I create an aquarium that has a full coral reef system? And it didn't occur to me that this might be difficult. I'd grown up, with an aquarium that had a few fish swimming around, and so I started doing this. But of course, the way I do these things is I had to figure out, well, if you're going to keep all these things alive in this, say, 200-gallon glass tank, how's that going to happen? And it reminded me of, like, how do we keep these vegetables? How do we get them to grow? How do we, keep them healthy and all that? Well, what I realized was that if you're going to have, you put in salt, this thing, but then before you put fish in, you got to think about, what's a fish do? Well, it eats stuff, and then it urinates and produces feces, but you have a closed tank. So over time, they're going to just poison the water and die. That's not going to work. So I read up some of this, and I found out, amazingly enough, the way you start a salt reef aquarium is you go out and get 2 bacteria types, one of which takes ammonia, which is what's in urine up from the fish, and breaks it down into nitrites. And then the second bacteria, each of these little bacteria are just little chemical factories, living chemical factories. And they do different things, right? The different bacteria species do different things. And so the second type takes the nitrite that the first one produces as a waste product and converts that to nitrate. Well, nitrate is fertilizer for plants. So once I get those 2 bacteria, which of course are totally invisible, you just look at this tank, it's water. You don't know that there's the bacteria. Now I can put plants in. But now the plants, are going to need sunlight. Well, okay. So I went out and got these incredibly brilliant halogen lights that are so hot, if you touch them, you'll burn your fingers. And I said, that'll be artificial sun. Well, the trouble is, the reason plants are green is because the photosynthetic molecule absorbs blue and red and emits green. That's why it looks green. But it needs to be fed in the blue and ultraviolet. So I had to get black lights, like, we used to have at parties, and add those. So, and then I'm directly feeding the black light energy in those wavelength bands into the plants. And then the plants are giving off oxygen. Now we have somewhere I can put fish in, because the fish have something to breathe, and they don't poison the water because the bacteria take care of that. Now you're ready to think about putting in corals. And the thing about people don't appreciate is corals are animals, but half of the energy that a coral gets is from the fact that the same chloroplasts which are in plants are in corals, even though they're animals. So they're kind of a hybrid between plants and animals. And so they love the lights that I set up. So I was basically building a living ecology, an environment. And then I just kept going. I said, well, what about shrimp? What about, what about little things that do this and that, and, all the little wiggly things you see in an aquarium and all that. So gradually I built this up to it's just this insane level of different kind of living things. But the same, you had to be sensitive to each of the creature's needs, what they needed to be healthy and thrive. And then you had to make sure that either you provided it from the outside, or you built a balanced ecosystem in which, like, for instance, the plants are giving off oxygen, the fish are breathing the oxygen, so they all start supporting each other. That was, of course, a multi-year experiment. It actually is more like
So now, Larry, that sounds to me where you're getting into this is part of your healing, right? This is a passion that feeds you. You're feeding them, but you're actually getting fed yourself to go on to your other new discoveries.
Right. And we teach our kids, just like my father taught me about the plants. We would bring the kids in, for instance, at night. I said, boys, we're going to go on a night dive, except we didn't have to do anything. We just have to go into the aquarium. And at night, it's a completely different living world. Wow. Because all these things come out at night that aren't there during the day. And so they got to begin to see that there's a whole, what we call circadian rhythm, which comes from the fact that the Earth rotates like this 24 hours around a star, which goes back to the astrophysics.